the kind of the old school of thought was when you were spinning, your horse is supposed to have that back inside foot was supposed to pivot. Okay, and that was 20 years ago. What we all tried to achieve is that back inside foot pivoting. And I don't really know if this horse is keeping that back foot perfect or not, but what I worry more about, and what we all worry more about nowadays, is that front end. Because these horses nowadays go so fast turning that front end. Not this particular horse, but you know, the true open quality horses, they turn so fast using that front, with their front end, that it's more of a balance with their back end. It's not so important to me anymore, or I think to anybody, that they just plant that pivot foot. If I'm riding a 2-year-old, or I've got one of my guys riding a 2-year-old, I want them to be, you know, I want them to keep that pivot foot in a box. You know, they don't have to drill a hole with it, but I want to keep it in a foot, you know, a foot square box. And as they get older and faster and find a style and turn harder and move that front end, you know, then a lot of horses will get to shuffle in those back feet a little bit, trying to catch up and are trying to balance themselves. So as far as keeping that inside pivot foot down, for me it's really not that important. I don't know a judge, when you're out there turning a 1, I don't know a judge in the industry that's watching his back pivot foot. You know, they just don't do it. So they're watching the overall picture, and like I say, today's horse is going so hard that you can't sit there and stare at that. You look at the overall picture, and that's more important. Now, where you run into problems is if they turn on the outside pivot foot. Okay, if they're turning hard enough, then sometimes you can get away with it, but it's really not ideal. And if I have one turning on that outside pivot foot, again, what we've talked about in some other segments is moving that hip over. So if they're turning on that outside pivot foot, I'll take that leg and I'll move his hip in, I'll hold his hip in with that outside leg, push his body over, and push him back over onto that inside pivot, okay? But most of the time, what pivot foot they're on relates to what they're doing in their front end when they're turning, what they're doing in their face when they're turning. If you've got them broke in their face, and they're standing up over their front end, and they're taking that good step with their inside front foot, most of the time, 99% of the time, they're going to be turning correct, and that pivot foot on the inside is going to be where it needs to be. Usually when you run into a problem being on the outside pivot foot, it's usually because they're sucking too far back. And at that point, I would push them back up over the top of their front feet and go back to making them take that step inside, keeping them soft, moving their hip, doing a lot of suppling exercises. And that's a brief overview of what I do with it, what I think about their pivot foot.